Hi, this is Andrew from Immersed Games. In this video, we will overview the branching dialogue editor, which is found in the dialogue task, an interaction task where the player will converse in dialogue with an in-game character and be able to choose responses. Here we are in the dialogue task. The first thing we want to do is write a task description to guide the player to the person we want to engage in dialogue with. Let's tell the player to talk to Farah, our intended in-game non-player character. The next segment is for defining who the intended target is, which as we mentioned is Farah. I will add Farah into the scene, place her, and define an idle animation for her, and finally set her as the intended target. This next segment is where we will cover the branching dialogue editor. To start, click on the Edit button here to enter the dialogue editor. Here we are in the dialogue editor where we will create the branching dialogue. Let us begin by overviewing this dialogue editor space. As you can see, we initially have a starting dialogue node right here where we will begin the construction of the dialogue branches. If we hold left click on our middle mouse button on the blank space and move our mouse, we can shift around the space. If I scroll with the mouse wheel, we can zoom in and out of the space. The first thing I want to do is have her say something to you when you first click on her. To do that, I have to create the first dialogue node by left click holding on this triangle, dragging the mouse over to an empty space, and letting go. As you can see, we have created our first dialogue node. We can see that the start dialogue node is connected to this dialogue node with an arrow, indicating the dialogue path. We can shift these nodes around to our liking for organization. If you click on the arrow itself, you can edit the shape of the arrows with these editing dots for organizational purposes. You can also remove the arrows by pressing the backspace button. But I want the attachment to be there, so I will recreate it with the old drag and drop, releasing my mouse on the starting dot of the dialogue node. Finally, if I double click on my arrow, my workspace will zoom into the node connected by the arrow. Let us go through this dialogue node. On the top bar here, we can then define the type of dialogue node this is. Newly created dialogue nodes default as a standard dialogue node, but this function here we can switch to several other types of dialogue nodes. For now, we'll just stick with the default, and we'll go through these other node types in a bit. Next to that is the delete node button, which deletes the node if desired. Let's move on to the next function. Here in this first row is what the NPC says to you. Since I want Farah to introduce herself first, I shall write the dialogue to reflect that. That seems good enough to me. The next row is the optional ability to add in a picture. Let's move on from that for now. The last row is the response type, which determines how the player would like to respond to the NPC statement. The first type is None from the drop-down menu. This can be useful if you want the NPC to have several chat bubble statements before the player character responds. Let's try that now. From here, I can click and drag to create a new node, to create a second bubble for the NPC to say. I'm going to type, "Nice to meet you." Just like that. With this setup, the dialogue will appear like so in the task interaction, as two separate chat bubbles. For the other option in the response row, we have branching, which is where we input the potential replies that the player can choose. I can type a response like "hello," and when I press enter, I will create a second potential dialogue that the player can choose. Perhaps a more direct response here. "Who are you?" And with that, there will be two options in the dialogue to choose from. You can add more if you like, or press the X button to remove any choices you dislike. So here is where the branching portion of the dialogue comes in. To create the NPC response to either player choice, left click and hold, drag and move from here to an empty space to create a new dialogue, like so. You will have to do it for each player response, which will create new dialogue nodes. I will now type a response to that first player choice. So this is the response to hello from Farah, but I feel like this response will actually work pretty well for who are you. So while I could just type the same thing into this node here, the same line, instead what I can simply do is direct this output to the same node, like so. As you can see, while outputs can only have one output connection, multiple arrows can connect to an input, ensuring in this case that either of these choices will end up with the same response. For this particular dialogue, I want to put an image just to illustrate this function. I think that goes pretty well with the dialogue that's in the response here. Now, I want to create a branching dialogue where the player responds in a way that will end this entire dialogue interaction. Let me set up a positive and negative response here. So with that, let's talk about the other dialogue node types. So over here, if we look here, we can see there are four other different dialogue node types. To begin, we have the complete dialogue option, which looks like this. What this indicates is that when the player selects this option, they leave the dialogue UI while completing the task. The next type is quit dialogue, which looks the same, and when the player chooses this option, they will leave the dialogue UI without completing the task, which means they will have to talk to Farah again to try to complete the task. The third option is the accept quest, which will display a quest acceptance modal. The player will complete or quit the dialogue based on whether they accept or deny the quest. Finally, we have complete quest, which displays a quest completion modal with confetti to indicate that the player has completed the quest and finished this entire quest. Voila, you have created a bunch of dialogue that will help the player interact with NPCs in the game. And that is the process of creating dialogue in the branching dialogue editor.